All right, good.
We're all set.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Snyder from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us for the Connect and Communicate series presenting Collecting Pennsylvania Political Twitter Data. This discussion will be recorded and it will be made available to Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division members through the PALA CRD YouTube channel, as well as sent to registrants and available on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you will only need a headset or speakers. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom right throughout the discussion, but I'm going to hold them until the end. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues. So please post those in the chat box as well, and we'll try to help you. This session is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate planning committee members, including Andrea Pratt, Adam Balchunas, Christy Alderman Ritter, Diane Porterfield, and Rana Lee Choco. Please contact anyone on the team for information about becoming a PALA member. This project is made possible by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services as administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Education through the Office of Commonwealth Libraries and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, Governor. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our presenters for today's event. John Russell is the Digital Humanities Librarian, and Andrew Dudash is the Librarian for Political Science, Policy Studies, and Government Information, both from Penn State University Libraries, University Park campus. Welcome, and with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. John and I are going to share with you our experience with collecting Pennsylvania Twitter data as we curated in 2018, prior to the 2018 election. John, can you advance the slide, please? So why Pennsylvania political Twitter data? Well, to get started, this work builds on an article in PalRep on Pennsylvania perspectives on the 2016 election, a project to collect web and social media content related to the 2016 election. And so this collecting Twitter data builds on off of that project, and what was learned from that project was that some of the web content was harder to collect, harder to archive, and the Twitter data was a little bit easier to collect. So what we did is we built off of the Twitter data from 2016, curated more accounts and hashtags in preparation for the 2018 election. Why? Again, so Pennsylvania's a battleground state, garners national attention. That's shown increased interest from presidential candidates, record-setting turnouts in the last couple elections. It's a snapshot of Pennsylvania-related political dialogue as far as what we've collected. And then events of political consequence are being discussed on Twitter, and that certainly was the case in 2018 and even more so in 2020. You can advance that. Thank you, John. So Twitter provides a landscape for Pennsylvania political discourse. Capturing this discourse for historical purposes, cultural purposes is important. It can be time sensitive to collect, and that's certainly the case as far as what we found related to suspended accounts, and in many cases the high volume of information that was created from these suspended accounts. And for some a little bit more in-depth reading on this issue in general, about information flow and social media, I'm recommending a study from the Stanford, I think, Election Integrity Center called The Long Fuse: Misinformation in the 2020 Election. It's a fascinating report on how information flow and social media related to the election. So
I wanted to say one thing about the time-sensitive nature, getting a little bit into the mechanism of tweets and Twitter data. If you don't collect the data as it's being generated, you may, because of suspended accounts or people deleting accounts or deleting tweets, you would then, going forward, not have access to those tweets. Because even though up until fairly recently, there was research access to historical Twitter data, the problem is if you do something retrospectively, if the account is locked, if the account is suspended, if tweets have been deleted, you can't get them from the Twitter API anymore. If somebody locks their account and then unlocks it, then yes, you would be able to get access. But I think when we say, it's time sensitive, that's, the sort of important technical reason why, because if a lot of this data, if you don't collect it, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to get access to it in the future. And that's even more so now, given things going on at Twitter, which we will talk about a little bit later on. And so how we did this, and I want to kind of circle back a little bit to the first slide or two, and thinking about the history. So while Andrew and I did the 2020 data collection, we were building on, as Andrew said, this 2016 project that was led by our now university archivist at the time. He was a digital archivist, Ben Goldman. Eric Novotny, our history librarian, was, I think, centrally, if not very heavily involved in identifying some of the groups to collect tweets from. And Jeff Knapp, our communications librarian, was also involved in identifying these groups. So when we say that we're, what we're talking about sort of built off this earlier work in a very real and significant way, or in a very direct way, like which tweets, while we tweaked it in 2018 and 2020, by and large, the accounts and the hashtags that we were collecting from were more like were really established in 2016 and 2018. Anyway, so I think it's worth acknowledging again and again the earlier collaborators on this project. And so to kind of summarize what is in our article and sort of what I was just talking about. So we focused with Twitter, you do have an option to geospatially limit the tweets that you collect, but that's not what we did. We focused on Pennsylvania specific organizational accounts, political parties, college and university groups like, Penn State GOP, Penn State Dems, that kind of thing. And other organizations, larger organizations that were known as groups that focus on statewide politics. We also, in addition to collecting all of the tweets generated by specific accounts, we also searched using particular hashtags. And as you can see here, we've listed them. They are Pennsylvania specific. We did not use sort of general hashtags like election or Trump or Biden or whatever, because then we'd run into, well, how do we know that these are Pennsylvania? So this is how we kind of tried to fix the parameters as much as possible, the parameters of the tweets that we were collecting. And how did we collect those tweets? We host an instance of something called Social Feed Manager, which is open source software developed at George Washington University Libraries. And it is a tool that allows you to kind of automate not just Twitter collection, but also I think it's Flickr, Weibo, and maybe one other that I'm blanking on. Those are the main ones. And so it's designed to automate the process, right? It gives you a graphical user interface, web-based. You can add in your, the hashtags you want to search for, create collections, give it your account credentials, and just let it run. And that's the key nice thing. It's just turning it on and letting it run. So it's automating that harvesting process. We did run into, particularly in the 2018 process, and a little bit in 2020, technical issues where it just shut down for various reasons. And so we had to come up with some workarounds. It wasn't a completely like turn it on and let it go and forget about it process. It was something that I and I think Ben Goldman too kept an eye on what was going on the server. And if it did shut down, we would restart it and then want to run a one-time search to pick up any tweets that we may have missed. And so then at the end of the process, we had a number of data sets that we could then deduplicate as a way of creating, as much as possible, a seamless snapshot of the 8 to 10 months of data collection that we had done. One of the kind of novel things that isn't in Social Feed Manager, somebody had written a program, this guy named Chris Schaefer, called Tweet Miner, that can be used to visualize kind of summary, like top 20 hashtags, top 20 most active users in your data set. So I modified that. It's an R program. I modified it to work with the way Social Feed Manager outputs data. I mean, it wasn't a hard modification. It was just changing a couple columns, really. And so we also created visualizations of the tweets, which we then bundled with the tweet IDs and the information about which accounts and hashtags we were searching with, and made them available in our institutional repository Scholarsphere. So I will say this link is to the 2020 data. Is the 2018 data. I have actually not put it in Scholarsphere, I realized yesterday. So if you're looking for that, it will be up this week. But why tweet IDs, right? So we're using the Twitter API, and the terms of service say you cannot share, large collections of tweets. You can only share the tweet IDs. And so that's what we put in our repository. And this is a quick, when I say these snapshots that we got, these are sort of visual overviews of the data. This is from 2020. And so this is of all of the accounts captured in our data set, what years or what months and years were those accounts created. And you can see that there are a number that were created in 2016 and a decent number that were created, because again, this is the 2020 data set, that were created in 2020. And here's just a quick most mentioned and retweeted accounts. There are a couple of interesting things in here. There are some spam accounts. Most of them are pretty high level, the AP, Donald Trump, Bob Casey, Joe Biden, things that you would expect. There were, interestingly, a couple individual accounts that were very, very heavily retweeted. That if anybody is interested in doing a little investigation, I think that both Andrew and I agree that there's some interesting stuff in here in terms of some of these individual accounts that are highly retweeted.
There are a few accounts on this list that are just individuals, and those accounts, were suspended either in the aftermath of the election or in the aftermath of January 6th. Not to mention some of the higher profile accounts that were suspended as well on the list. So
I will say, I believe that one of the spam accounts was actually never suspended, which I mean, it was ridiculous that it wouldn't get suspended. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. And then also here's just a snapshot of the most mentioned hashtags. And you can see the volume. So the Team PA hashtag was mentioned over 40,000 times in our data set. And this data set's about 58,000 tweets, roughly.
Looking ahead, as far as, what did we want to consider doing this again? We decided not to run the same capture in 2022. We felt like the unique felt like the landscape had changed. We would kind of need to take a whole new look at accounts and hashtags, post 2020. I think, John, did we stopped collecting after the election was certified in December.
Certified in December.
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things about this is, we turned off the social feed manager prior to January 6th, which would have, it would always kind of interesting to see what it might have looked like after that. But also, with the new issues of Twitter instability, ownership, we decided that this was something that would be a nice, we wouldn't want to capture it the same way we did. But we certainly have built a model here for others to kind of look at this landscape. Again, in these accounts and hashtags, the curation began with Jeff Knapp and Eric Novotny and Ben Goldman. And then we kind of continue that curation in 18 to where it exists for the 18 and 20. But I think social media data should be looked at more broadly in general. And so I think that's kind of our biggest takeaway today.
And so with changing Twitter policies, like I think was fairly recently at the beginning of this month, there's no longer a free API to use. And so like my social feed manager account no longer works, right? Because I would have to pay $100, $200 in order to use it. The other thing that does that really messes with this process is that because the terms of service required sharing just the tweet IDs, those things can be what's called rehydrated using the Twitter API, which means you can use a program called Tweet Hydrator that's done by the Documenting the Now people. Actually, it was created primarily by Ed Summers. But it requires the use of the Twitter API in order to use it. And so in terms of public accessibility to this data, it's not so great. I mean, obviously, we internally still have the full Twitter data set. We can, according to the terms of service, share it with folks inside of our organization. And I have done so. There are some students and faculty in our College of Communication who were interested in sort of looking at a few things in there. But anyway, the end of the free API use is a big hit to the use of Twitter social media data. And the other thing is there's still an academic research account process, but it's not, it's not clear how long that will last. Nobody seems to know whether or not they've actually been approving new requests. And there are some anecdotal claims that it's actually getting harder to get your academic research request approved. Anyway, it's a bit of a mess. And a couple things to kind of end with, like there are other social media platforms than Twitter, right? Twitter got a lot of the focus for so long because its API was really easy to use. And they did a really good job making that data accessible to a lot of different audiences. And so now people, I follow a number of social media folks on Mastodon and on Twitter, and there's a lot of like, now what are we going to do? What's sort of next? But there are still options. You can access and scrape tweets from Twitter without using the API. It's a little bit of a legal gray area in some ways, and traditionally I haven't supported it. Can, you know, like if somebody asks, I can point them to a program on GitHub, but I've sort of shied away from it. But there is on GitHub this first item here, this FN scrape is something that actually will scrape a number of different social media platforms using the Python programming language. But it will scrape Twitter without, and there are other tools for scraping Twitter as a website, not using the API. In Toronto, at the University of Toronto, there's a social media lab, and they have a number of apps for working with different social media platforms. YouTube, Reddit is very popular. Their API, I am told, is easy to use. There's another brand new tool put out by MIT called Scraper, which is a web-based API ingest tool that also does a lot of the usual suspects. And I also linked to a Twitter thread by Dean Freeland, who is a professor at in the UNC I school, whatever that's called, Information Library Sciences School, I think. But anyway, he's one of the big social media scraper guys. He's actually created a program for scraping TikTok data called TikTok. But anyway, he put together a thread recently on Twitter of resources that he's aware of for dealing with other social media platforms. And I say all of this for a couple of reasons. One is, you know, there are other sort of ways of doing things, you know, Twitter's API nonsense notwithstanding. But also, you know, it's a pretty big world. There are resources available for that you can point people to. But it's also, it's a little bit hard to keep up with. And one of the things that I'm looking to do this year, so I have a flip guide that's a Twitter research guide, and I've been focused just on Twitter. But now kind of looking ahead and sort of moving on from this project is clearly I need a social media research guide and have a place where I can kind of keep track of what are all these different options, so that researchers on my campus and honestly from others, because I get traffic from a lot of places outside of Penn State on that Twitter guide, to be able to point people and sort of support folks who are interested in working with social media data. And with that, we are done. Thank you very much. And we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. While you're thinking about your questions and posting them in the chat box, we're going to go ahead and post an evaluation survey in the chat box. So before you leave, it's important that you take the time to submit your responses, as we are required to submit evaluation data as part of our LSTA grant application. So I'm going to paste that in the chat box.
I'm going to stop sharing.
Right. And there was a comment from before from Eric about 2016 archive data. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you, Eric. It is, the 2016 data is on our PSU Scholarsphere. But yeah, it's messy in the sense that each sort of approach, the data is in a lot of the tweet IDs, for instance, are in a lot of different files. And one of the things that I did slightly differently was to create a zip file so that there's one master file of all the tweet IDs. I wanted to have it all in one place because my experience with looking at the 2016 data in Scholarsphere is that it was a little bit chaotic for my tastes. Nothing again, like that's not a slam on Ben, It was just, I knew I wanted to approach it differently.
Right. We have another question. I remain fascinated by the spam troll accounts. Care to say anything more about any you saw amongst the data collected?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get into sort of details, but yet, I mean, there was one spam account that was spamming Republican hashtags with images. That's all I'm going to say. And there were multiple accounts doing this. It was clearly a coordinated attack. So we have a lot of that data. But I think maybe more interesting, I like that part, you know, whatever. But I think more interesting, and I'm going to let Andrew talk a little bit about this, is a couple of the accounts that we saw that were relatively new and weren't spam troll accounts per se, but like were new accounts that became absurdly popular very quickly. I don't know, Andrew, if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think back to Eric's question, you know, some of the hashtags with the sexual references in the center of some of those clusters were clear attacks on, you know, by one or two accounts that, you know, on certain Republican politicians. Back to, you know, to kind of follow up with on what John said, the one account that managed to get suspended that was pretty prolific from just a single entity was created sometime in, you know, late September of 2020, and was just a prolific poster of information. Poster is not the right word, but just a prolific tweeter and retweeter. And that to me, that was the most interesting thing, is that some of these accounts were very new, and it was instant, you know, like it was how you could produce that volume in that short period of time was really fascinating to me.
And that it seems like it's a real person, right? Like it's not like, you know, no, like a fake image, a weird user handle. It's like an individual who seems pretty clearly to be an actual person living in Western Pennsylvania. Like, but at the same time, just like it is, you know, as I said, like it's in her account was retweeted in the top 10 of all of our retweeted accounts.
Yeah, and there were two in particular on the list, and the one was much newer than the other, but there was no indication that either of the accounts worked, because we were doing some research when we were starting to create some of these charts and kind of looking at some of this, you know, just to see if you know, I was curious. I was like, oh, how many of these accounts actually got suspended from our list? And that's when I started to see this, and there was no indication that they were anything but someone who was energized and, you know, putting out a lot of information, right? So that's, I mean, as simply as I can, you know, as simply as I can state it, right? That's, you know, there's a lot of energy that goes into that, and you do put out a lot of information. So.
We have another question. Have either of you worked with students or faculty on this type of research? And have you noticed any trends as to the topics?
Yes. Well, yes to the first, no to the second. So I've been informally supporting folks working on Twitter data since I think 2017. And, you know, I've had grad students working on Black Lives Matter. I've had people interested in things relating to COVID, and either trying to find data or figure out how they themselves can collect this data. I've worked a lot, I would say primarily with the College of Communication, and there's a group related to, I think, in public relations, where they did a pretty big project collecting tweets from, I think it's like a number of companies looking at different issues related to sustainability and sustainability initiatives and how certain issues are talked about. But also, prior to me doing this, Ben Goldman in Special Collections was working with folks also in communication, unlike autonomous driving or autonomous vehicles, bees or bee collectors or something, I forget what it was, something to do with bees. So there were a lot of, it's kind of a little bit all over the place. I would say in general, in my experience here at Penn State, the folks who have been interested in it are in sort of communication studies, who are, and I could see if I were to kind of extrapolate, like at some other institution, where might you look for people who are interested in these issues or interested in working with social media? Business schools, marketing, people doing public relation, communication studies. Those are going to be the main areas. A long time ago, when I first started here at Penn State in 2016, there was somebody working on Japanese Twitter novels, but he had already had the data. He was more interested in collecting stuff, but has been some interest in the past in the humanities in certain genres of writing that have popped up on social media platforms. I expect a number of people to start really paying a lot more attention to the different issues on TikTok for sure, going forward. But I've also seen folks looking at somebody in political science, Andrew. I went to a talk recently, who's working on YouTube videos relating to politics. But anyway, so I could see like political science might be another area. But anyway, that's hypothetical at this point.
And several students, both in the center in the social data analytics program, there was a recent a talk by one of the SOTA PhD students on Telegram Messenger data. And then I know some other students have captured some other social media data that's, either still not, not available, or, the social data analytics students mostly are looking for that. It does intersect with political science. Not as many undergrads, or at least not as many undergrads kind of using us to help them, collect this data, or I might refer someone to John. But I think undergrads are maybe doing it on a smaller scale, right? They're not looking for a giant amount of data that a social data analytics student would be looking for. Right? They might just be looking for something smaller. So, it's, there's no shortage of literature in communications, political science, and a number of other fields that are looking at, how terrorist organizations are using social media, or any social media is being used to formulate opinions on elections, or religion, or and everything in between. So
I do want to say sort of one last kind of general library thing about that. Like, by and large, the kinds of questions are very few people. I mean, there are occasions where people have approached me and said, "Can you collect this data for me?" Which I don't do. Like our social feed manager instance, we've used with some faculty members. but all that is setting up their account and letting them manage it. But for, I would say, a lot of the emails that I get around, again, primarily Twitter data, but sometimes around social media data, it's just pointing people to resources. You know, like, it's not about, it's even not so much about showing people how to use stuff. It's basically just like, oh, can you use Python or not? Okay, you can. Okay, great. Here are your options. Or go to GitHub, search for whatever you're looking for, Reddit, Scraper, and you know, the language that you are most familiar with. It's very like a lot of, I have to say, just in general, a lot of digital scholarship consultations, a lot of pointing people in a direction and kind of like, here you go. Because in most cases, folks who are doing this work, you know, are ready to do this work and don't really need the technical training. They need to sort of be pointed in a direction. Where can I find X, Y, or Z?
Any other questions, or if you want to come off mic, feel free. I saw you had some links in your presentation. If you're willing to share your slides, we can share those out with folks.
Yep. Should I just send them to you?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll make sure they get to where they need to go.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will do that.
Well, I am going to go ahead and stop the recording.